All right, let's jump right in. So when you think about early Islamic society, there's this really fascinating, almost contradictory picture. On one hand, you've got this powerful legal ideal of freedom. But on the other hand, you have the day-to-day reality of slavery, something that was just everywhere. So how on earth did the first Muslims deal with that? That's what we're going to unpack.
So, right at the core of Islamic legal thought, you find this huge principle. It basically says that freedom, well, that's the default setting for every single human being. You're considered free unless someone can prove otherwise. It's the starting point, the natural state.
But that's where things get really complicated, right? I mean, how do you actually live by that principle in a world where slavery isn't just a thing? It's a legally regulated institution. Where do you even draw the line? And, what happens when real life, poverty, debt, all that messy stuff starts pushing up against that beautiful ideal?
Well, to figure that out, we have to do a little bit of historical detective work. We need to dig into this early period of intense legal debate. A lot of this stuff has been totally forgotten, We're looking for the arguments, the controversies that kind of got swept under the rug when the big official law books were written later on.
And you've really got to get this distinction. So for the first couple of centuries of Islam, what scholars call the pre-literary period, it was like the Wild West of legal ideas. You had lively, controversial debates happening all over the place. Rulings were different depending on whether you were in Egypt or Iraq. It was messy. But then, starting in the 8th century, you get the literary period. This is when everything gets organized, compiled into these huge, systematic legal codes. And yeah, that created a consensus, but in the process, a lot of those early, messy, and fascinating debates just disappeared.
Okay, so let's go back to that early, messy period. Where was this whole presumption of freedom idea really put to the test? Well, the sources point to 3 major battlegrounds. First, the idea of being enslaved because of debt. Second, the sale of your own family members. And third, what to do with abandoned children or foundlings.
So, let's tackle that first one, enslavement for debt. And this is a really shocking idea when you look at later Islamic law. The thought that you, a free person, could lose your freedom just because you couldn't pay someone back? I mean, that was pretty common in, say, the Roman world. But how did the early Muslim legal thinkers deal with it? And that brings us to this really bizarre story about a guy named Suraq. The tradition goes that Suraq was basically a scammer who showed up in Medina and racked up a bunch of debt. So his creditors, totally fed up, dragged him in front of the Prophet Muhammad. And here's the shocking part. The Prophet allegedly orders him to be sold on the market to pay everyone back. But then there's this twist. The creditors have a change of heart, and inspired by faith, they decide to just set him free.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting. This whole story is, well, it's full of holes. For one thing, it seems the story was mostly told in Egypt, not Medina, where it was supposed to have happened. That's a red flag. But even bigger than that, the Prophet's supposed ruling completely contradicts the Quran, which says to be patient with debtors. It also goes against the Constitution of Medina, which called for helping people in debt. In fact, a major legal scholar from Medina, al-Zuri, flat out said he'd never heard of a single case where the Prophet sold a free person for debt. So something doesn't add up.
And this just goes to show there was no one-size-fits-all answer back then. Just look at the different regions. In Egypt, they kind of accepted a form of debt bondage, where you work off what you owe. In Iraq, some scholars even said a person could willingly put themselves into bondage. But then you go to the Hijaz, the heartland, Mecca and Medina, and the major scholars there, like Zuri, were basically saying, no way, freedom is not up for grabs over a debt. So you've got 3 different places with 3 totally different takes on the issue.
All right, on to the second challenge. And this one's tough. We're talking about people selling their own family members, their children, even their wife. Now, this wasn't something that came out of nowhere. It had roots in the wider world at the time, what we call late antiquity, and it was almost always driven by just crushing poverty. So how did the early Muslim legal thinkers even begin to tackle something like this?
And the legal thinking here gets incredibly tangled. Let's just walk through this one ruling from that same scholar, al-Zuri. It's wild. So a father sells his adult daughter. Step 1, Zuri says the sale is totally illegal. Okay, makes sense. But then it goes off the rails. He punishes both the father and the daughter with 100 lashes for having illicit sex. And then step 3, he makes the buyer pay a dower, like a marriage payment, which basically turns the whole thing into a marriage after the fact. And to top it all off, the father then has to pay that same dower back to the buyer as a fine. It's this insane legal maze where the actual crime, the selling of a person, gets completely lost. The focus shifts entirely to the sexual act, and the victim, the daughter, ends up getting punished as a criminal. Okay, our third and final battleground. What happens to foundlings? We're talking about abandoned children, just left and then discovered by a stranger. This raises a huge question. Is that child automatically free, or does the person who finds them, who raises them, have the right to treat them as a slave?
And just like with the debt issue, we see a massive change over time. In those early days, some scholars, especially in places like Iraq, were saying that the finder actually got to choose. They could raise the child as free, or they could raise them as a slave, which, by the way, sounds a lot like old Roman provincial law. But fast forward to that later, more systematic period, and the answer is completely different. The consensus becomes absolute: a foundling is always free. No exceptions, no choice.
So, that brings us to the big question, right? If you have all these passionate debates about huge, real-world problems like debt and abandoned kids, why did they all just seem to disappear? Why don't you find them in the big, famous Islamic law books that came later?
This simple answer is they just got left out. When the time came to write those massive, systematic legal codes, all these messy, controversial regional arguments were pushed to the side. They were ignored in favor of creating a much cleaner, more unified, and frankly, simpler version of the law.
But wait a second. Does that mean the problems themselves just vanished? Did people suddenly stop having debt? Did poverty just disappear? Did children stop being abandoned? Of course not, right?
No, the problems were still there. What changed was the goal of legal writing. Those later law books, the fiqh, they weren't trying to be history books that recorded every single argument. They were more like rule books, systematic guides to the established law. And if a really messy, complicated social issue didn't fit neatly into that new, clean structure, well, it often just got left on the cutting room floor.
So, okay, this is all fascinating history, but why does it matter now? What can we learn from digging up these forgotten debates about how law and society actually function?
Well, here's what I think you should take away from this. First, Islamic law, just like any legal system, wasn't just handed down perfectly formed. It was a messy, evolving, very human process, full of arguments. Second, there's always a tension between our highest ideals and the gritty realities of everyday life. Third, the official books never tell the whole story. To really understand a society, you have to look for the debates they stopped having. When we do that, we get a much more nuanced, more complex, and frankly, more real picture of the past.
And that really leaves us with one final thought, one that's way bigger than just early Islam. Looking at how they struggled with these issues forces us to look in the mirror and ask a question every single society has to face. How do we, right here, right now, deal with the gap between our highest ideals and our toughest, most uncomfortable realities?